Every week the preacher makes a major decision. What am I going to preach about? For me, that decision is driven by my conviction that the sermon must be both biblical and relevant. The sermon should reflect the biblical passage in its theme and message and points. And the sermon should speak to current issues or to needs of the listeners. You should give them something they can take home and put into practice. That's why I like preaching through Bible books section by section. Each book of the Bible is a message of and from God through Holy Spirit-inspired authors to address the needs of God's people. So preaching through biblical books automatically assists you to preach sermons that are biblical and relevant. This year the Kerusso experience is on preaching the book of Philippians. But which passage of Philippians should I preach? Well, that's the first decision you have to make. When I turn to the book of Philippians, I find there are 4 chapters with a total of 104 verses. But in the original manuscripts, there were no chapter and verse divisions, just one continuous narrative from the beginning to the end of the book. So theoretically, it would be possible to preach the main message of Philippians in a single sermon. But most of the time, it's advisable to break down the book into smaller preaching units and preach through the book over several Sundays. Oh, this raises important questions. Well, how many verses do I cover in a single sermon? And if I'm only going to preach a portion of the book, how do I determine the beginning and the end of my preaching unit? Well, you don't want to divide up Philippians arbitrarily. Such an arbitrary division would result in distorting the flow of the thought of the book, as well as resulting in sermons that were very choppy and disunified. A better approach would be to think of thought units. Now, these are simply sections of the book that contain a unified thought. That is, a thought that can stand alone, yet also contributes to the unfolding of the flow of the book. Well, how many verses are in a thought unit? Good question. But there's no magical formula. A thought unit might be as small as 2 or 3 verses, or as large as an entire chapter or more. But deciding where a thought unit begins and ends is where to begin. Well, how do I recognize a thought unit? Good question. If you have a Bible with section headings, as most of us do, I suggest you begin there. Scholars have translated the book of Philippians, added these section headings as a way of helping you see the flow of the book. Now, more often than not, I end up agreeing with the scholar's opinion about the section headings, but not always. So feel free to make up your own decision on where a thought unit begins and ends. In addition, you might consider the outline of the book that nearly every commentary contains. Once again, the scholars, by providing these outlines, have helped you to see how the book might be broken up into smaller preachable units. Now, once you've decided what section of Philippians you're going to preach in this sermon, what next? Well, the next task is to identify and formulate what Haddon Robinson calls the big idea of the text that you're preaching. And the big idea of the text is going to become the big idea of the sermon. What do we mean by the big idea? Terms that correspond to the big idea with which you might already be familiar are theme, thesis, proposition, main thought. Whichever term you prefer, the point is that an effective sermon must focus on a single specific major idea, and that all the points and subdivisions of the sermon should be parts of that one idea. Well, how do you formulate the big idea? Haddon Robinson argues that the big idea consists of two elements, a subject and a complement. By subject, we simply mean the answer to the question, what am I talking about in this sermon? Well, the subject can never be a single word like evangelism, discipleship, or sin. Single words may masquerade as subjects, but they're too vague to be helpful. For example, can you really preach a single sermon covering all aspects of sin? I think not. You could cover specific aspects of sin, like the causes or the characteristics or the consequences. But a subject cannot stand alone. It needs a complement. The complement completes the subject by answering the question, what am I going to say about what I'm going to talk about? All right, if the terms subject and complement are a little confusing, then try thinking of the subject as a question and the complement as an answer to the question. Both of those together form the big idea. Robinson observes that behind every subject there is a question stated or implied. And your subject can always be stated in the form of the question using one of those interrogatives you've already learned in school. How, what, why, when, where, or who. Well, all of this has been theoretical. Let's look at an example from James chapter 1, beginning in verse 5. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways. Well, initially you might think that the big idea of this text is wisdom. You're on the right track, but you're not specific enough. Go back to the passage, and you will find that James is more precisely talking about how to obtain wisdom. Yet, looking at the immediate context of the passage, you come to find that James is even more precisely talking about how to obtain wisdom in the midst of trials. So in James, the subject is how to obtain wisdom in the midst of trials. And the complement is ask God for wisdom in faith. Subject and complement, question and answer give you the big idea, which is wisdom in trials is obtained by asking God for it in faith. Now you have your big idea from the text. And that big idea will become the big idea of your sermon. And everything in your sermon should relate directly to that big idea that you have formulated from the text itself. May God bless you in this important work.